Hello everyone and welcome to Southern Community Church's video message of the week. As lockdown is starting to lift, it seems strange that for most of us this year we have had to stay in isolation from each other. Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright and short story writer who is considered to be among the greatest writers of short fiction in history. And he wrote a story about isolation which is called The Bet. Let me share the story with you today. This is how it starts. It was a dark autumn night. The old banker was anxiously walking up and down his study and remembering how 15 years before he had given a party one autumn evening. There had been many clever men there, and there had been many interesting and heated conversations. Among other things, they had talked of capital punishment. The majority of the guests, among whom were many journalists and intellectual men, disapproved of the death penalty. In the opinion of some of them, the death penalty ought to be replaced everywhere by imprisonment for life. "I don't agree with you," said their host, the banker. "I have not tried either the death penalty or imprisonment for life. But I think the death penalty is more humane than imprisonment for life, because capital punishment kills a man at once, but lifelong imprisonment kills him slowly. Which executioner is the more humane? He who kills you in a few minutes, or he who drags the life out of you in the course of many years?" Among the guests was a young lawyer, a young man aged about 25. And when he was asked for his opinion, he said, "The death sentence and the life sentence are equally immoral. But if I had to choose between the death penalty and imprisonment for life, I would certainly choose the second. To live anyhow is better than not to live at all." A lively and heated discussion arose, and the banker was getting more excited. He was younger and more impetuous in those days. He was suddenly carried away by excitement. He struck the table with his fist, shouted at the young man, "It's not true. I'll bet you 2 millions that you wouldn't stay in solitary confinement for 5 years." "If you mean that in earnest," said the young man, "I'll take the bet. But I would stay not 5 but 15 years. 15? Done," cried the banker. Turning to the assembled crowd, the banker shouted, "Gentlemen, I stake 2 millions. "Agreed," said the young man. "You stake your millions and I stake my freedom." And so this wild, senseless bet was carried out. The banker, with millions to his name, was delighted at the bet. He made fun of the young man and said, "Think better of it, young man, while there is still time. To me, 2 millions are a trifle, but you are losing 3 or 4 years of the best of your life. I say 3 or 4 because you won't stay any longer. Don't forget that voluntary confinement is a great deal harder to bear than compulsory. The thought that you have the right to step out in liberty at any moment will poison your whole existence in prison. I'm very sorry for you." And now, 15 years later, the banker, pacing back and forth, remembered all of this and asked himself, what was the point of that bet? What was the good of that man losing 15 years of his life, and my throwing away 2 millions? Can it prove that the death penalty is better or worse than imprisonment for life? No. It was all nonsense and meaningless. On my part it was the caprice of a pampered man, and on his part simply greed for the money. And then he remembered what followed that evening. It was decided that the young man should spend the years of his captivity under the strictest supervision in one of the lodges in the banker's garden. It was agreed that for 15 years he should not be free to cross the threshold of the lodge, to see the human beings, to hear the human voice, or to receive letter and newspapers. He was allowed to have a musical instrument, and as many books as he wanted, and he was allowed to write letters, to drink wine, and to smoke. By the terms of the agreement, the only relations he could have with the outer world were by a little window made purposely for that object. He might have anything he wanted, books, music, food, and so on, in any quantity he desired, by writing an order, but he could only receive them through the window. The agreement provided for every detail and every trifle that would make his imprisonment strictly solitary, and bound the young man to stay there exactly 15 years, beginning from 12 o'clock of November the 14th, 1870, and ending at 12 o'clock on November the 14th, 1885. The slightest attempt on his part to break the conditions, even if it was only for a minute or two, before the end, released the banker from the obligation to pay him £2 million. And for the first year of his confinement, the prisoner suffered severely from loneliness and depression. The sounds of the piano could be heard continually day and night from his lodge. He refused wine and tobacco. Wine, he wrote, excites the desires, and desires are the worst foes of the prisoner. And besides, nothing could be more dreary than drinking good wine and seeing no one. And tobacco, he said, spoilt the air of his room. So he turned to reading. In the first year, the books he sent for were principally of a light character, novels with a complicated love plot, sensational and fantastic stories, and so on. In the second year, the prisoner asked only for the classics to be read. In the fifth year, music was audible again, and the prisoner asked for wine. Those who had watched him through the window said that all that year he just spent doing nothing, but eating and drinking and lying on his bed, frequently yawning and angrily talking to himself. He did not read any books during that time, and sometimes at night he would sit down to write. He would spend hours writing, and in the morning tear up all that he had written. More than once he could be heard crying. In the second half of the sixth year, the prisoner began zealously studying languages, philosophy, and history. He threw himself eagerly into his studies, so much that the banker had enough to do to get him all the books that he ordered. In the course of 4 years, some 600 volumes were procured at his request. Then, after the 10th year, the prisoner sat immovably at the table and read nothing but the Bible. It seemed strange to the banker that a man who in 4 years had mastered 600 learned volumes should waste nearly 5 years reading just one book. And the old banker remembered all this, and thought tomorrow at 12 o'clock he would regain his freedom. By our agreement I ought to pay him £2 million, but if I do not pay him it is all over with me. I shall be utterly ruined. 15 years before he was rich beyond counting, but now he was in debt. Desperately gambling on the stock exchange had by degrees led to the decline of his fortune, and the proud, fearless, self-confident millionaire had become a banker of middling rank, struggling to make ends meet. Stupid bet, muttered the old man, clutching his head in despair. Why didn't the man die? He's only 40 now. He will take my last penny from me. He will marry, he will enjoy life, while I shall look at him with envy like a beggar. No, it's too much. And while he was thinking these things, it struck 3 o'clock in the morning. The banker listened. Everyone was asleep in the house, and nothing could be heard outside but the rustling of the chilled trees. I know what I'll do, he thought. I'll go and suffocate him while he sleeps, so that I won't have to pay him any of the money. Trying to make no noise, he took from a fireproof safe the key of the door, which had not been opened for 15 years, put on his overcoat and went out of the house. It was dark and cold in the garden. Rain was falling. A damp, cutting wind was racing about the garden, howling and giving the trees no rest. The banker strained his eyes, but could see neither the earth, nor the white statues, nor the lodge, nor the trees. But going to the spot where the lodge stood, he twice called the watchman. No answer followed. Evidently the watchman had sought shelter from the weather, and he was now asleep somewhere, either in the kitchen or in the greenhouse. If I carry out my intention, thought the old man, suspicion would fall first upon the watchman. He felt in the darkness for the steps and the door, and went into the entry of the lodge. Then he groped his way into a little passage and lit a match. There was not a soul there. The seals on the door leading to the prisoner's rooms were intact. When the match went out, the old man, trembling with emotion, peeped through the little window. A candle was burning dimly in the prisoner's room. He was sitting at the table. Nothing could be seen but his back, the hair on his head, and his hands. 5 minutes passed, and the prisoner did not once stir. The banker cautiously broke the seals off the door, put the key in the keyhole. The rusty lock gave a grating sound, and the door creaked. The banker expected to hear at once footsteps and a cry of astonishment. But minutes passed, and it was as quiet as ever in the room. He made up his mind to go in. At the table, a man was sitting motionless. He was asleep. In front of his bowed head, There lay on the table a sheet of paper on which there was something written in fine handwriting. Poor creature, thought the banker. He is asleep and most likely dreaming of the millions he's going to win, and I've only to stifle him a little with a pillow, and the most conscientious expert would not find any sign of a violent death. But let us first read what he has written here. The banker took the page from the table and read as follows. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock I regain my freedom and the right to associate with other men. But before I leave this room and see the sunshine, I think it necessary to say a few words to you. For 15 years I've been intently studying earthly life. It is true I've not seen the earth or men, but in books I've found all kinds of worldly wisdom. All that the thought of man has created in the ages has made me wiser than all of you, and yet I despise that wisdom and the blessings of this world. It's all worthless, fleeting, illusionary, and deceptive like a mirage. I have found something much more durable. I have found the true worth of a man. To prove to you in action how I despise all that you live by, I renounce the 2 millions of which I have once dreamed as paradise, and which I now despise. To deprive myself of the right to the money, I shall go out from here 5 hours before the time fixed, and so break the contract. When the banker had read this, he laid the page on the table and went out of the lodge weeping. At no other time, even when he had lost heavily on the stock exchange, had he felt so great a contempt for himself. Next morning the watchman ran in with pale face, told him that he had seen the man who lived in the lodge climb out of the window into the garden and go to the gate and disappear. The banker went at once with the servant to the lodge and made sure of the flight of the prisoner. He took from the table the writing in which the millions were renounced, and when he got home, locked it up in the fireproof safe. What was it that the man had discovered while he was in solitary confinement? What did he find that was worth more than the money he would have won? Chekhov doesn't say, but I think it was the same thing that was discovered by King Solomon, who was the wisest man who ever lived. King Solomon wrote 3 books in the Bible. The first was Song of Solomon, which describes his feelings and emotions as a young man. The second is the book of Proverbs, which contains so much wisdom on the best way to live. But in his old age, Solomon wrote a book called Ecclesiastes, or the Preacher. In the book he described how he tried everything to gain an understanding for the meaning of life. He tried pleasure and entertainment, study, great projects, learning lots of new things, and he reached the same conclusion as the young lawyer, that life was in itself meaningless without God. But Solomon goes on to say, God has set eternity in our hearts. God does not give us the blueprint to life and then let us run things on our own. Life lived apart from God does not make sense, but by God's grace, a man can see life as a gift from God. We cannot earn or hoard this gift. Each day's troubles are enough for each day, said Jesus. God gives us grace each day as a free gift from his hand, so that we can fulfill our assignments and sense his presence in the midst of them. Solomon saw how people who walked with the living God were strengthened through pain and received joy that others could not understand. Solomon saw people who knew that they had been created for eternity and did not fear that, because they had an answer to that longing also. And here's what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, as he sums up what life is all about. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. So is life all about making money and raising a family? Is it about making a difference or following your heart? Is there a reason we're all here? Well, God gives us the answer. He made us. He designed us. He set this planet in motion and gave us meaning. And that meaning is to love and serve God. And the way to find the peace that God is so willing to give is we have to come to him in the right way. And that's to put our trust in Christ Jesus and what he has done for us. And if you want to find out more about trusting Jesus, then start to read the Bible today. Start at the Gospel of Mark and read all about what Jesus did. Or you can always contact us at the address which follows. We'll send you a Bible and we'll pray for you. Thanks for listening, and God bless you all. Bye-bye, and we'll see you again soon.